couple of years ago, I wrote this book here, Racing Camaros, an International Photographic History. It basically documents the early racing career of the Camaro and its various different guises around the world. And right here on page 154, you'll see the car that we're featuring today. This is Red Dawson's 1970 Z28 Camaro. It's a car with a really long and fascinating New Zealand racing history. It's a car that I myself have been fascinated by for years and years and years, and in fact about 20 years ago I wrote quite a detailed magazine article on the car detailing all its history and everything. But here's the thing, this is the first time that I've ever seen the car in the flesh. The first time I've ever seen it in the flesh is today. It's been hidden sort of in plain view for many, many years. It's been with the same owner for about 30 odd years, from the 1980s. But in 2018 it was purchased by my friend Keith, and about a week ago it finally arrived here in his amazing collection. So I'm really excited to show you around this car because it's one that's really special to me, and it's a really neat and unique piece of New Zealand racing history. So here it is, folks. This is Red Dawson's 1970s Z28 Camaro. What I'll do quickly is just talk you through the car's racing history. So basically Red had been campaigning up, in 1971 Red had been campaigning a 1967 Shelby American Group 2 Mustang. He won the 1970 New Zealand Saloon Car Championship with that car. In fact, he finished first equal with Rod Coppins, who was racing a Camaro. But by 1971, the old Mustang was getting pretty long in the tooth. So he started looking for a replacement, and I'll show you just over here, and amongst all the incredible information and photos and details and things that came with this car. This is an advertisement from Carcraft, not that Carcraft, but Carcraft in Vancouver. And they were selling this 1970 Mustang sports roof. It was available in various different guises, and as you could see, it could have been bought with a 351 motor. For whatever reason, Red didn't purchase the car. I assume that he went to the USA in 1971 specifically to purchase this car, but for whatever reason he didn't. He instead came back with this, and it was not a race car, it was a street car, although it had apparently been doing a little bit of drag racing, but it was a street car that had to be converted into a race car here in New Zealand, and it made its racing debut in late 1971, basically as you see it here in these colours, in the Kensington Carpets colours, beautiful gold with the black stripes. And Red raced the car for 4 seasons. He nearly won the 1972 New Zealand Saloon Car Championship. The championship, or the 6 litre championship for the big bore 6 litre cars, came down to Red and Paul Fahey driving a 1970 Mustang sports roof, and the pair of them went into the final round of the championship almost equal on points, and basically whoever came out on top would take the title. Unfortunately for Red, the motor blew, his race motor blew in practice, and so he had to fit his only spare, which was basically a stock motor, and that motor blew in, I think, the first race, and so he lost the championship, but he did come pretty close to actually winning it. He ran the car for 3 seasons in this colour scheme, and then for the 4th season he picked up sponsorship from Marlboro Cigarettes, and the car was repainted red and white, and in my opinion it didn't look nearly as good in the red and white colours as what it does in the gold. Then he, 1975, he purchased what was the very first Decon tube frame Monza. In fact, it was the car that was raced by Decon Engineering at, I believe, Road America in 1975, and should have won on debut had it not crashed with a lapped car. It was being driven by Horst Tweck. Red purchased Decon 1001, and this car was sold to rugby player Don Petty and motoring journalist Alan Dick. The pair of them owned a car dealership, and I believe Don actually bought the Camaro without consulting Alan, and Alan wasn't too impressed from my understanding. The idea was that it be a promotional tool for the car dealership, but I think really just Don wanted to go racing. But anyway, they got Kevin Haig to drive the car. They picked up sponsorship from Zephyr Heaters, and it was repainted cream and brown. And Kevin Haig in 1974 won the South Island Oscar Championship. Oscar stands for Open Saloon Car Association. And he, in 1974, he won the championship with a 1967 Shelby Mustang. And then he won the championship again in 1976 with this car. I believe it was driven on one occasion by New Zealand single-seater racing legend Ken Smith. It was pretty rare that Ken actually drove anything other than a single-seater. Then it was sold to Lawrence Bruce, and Lawrence continued to race the car in the Oscar series. When it was owned by Lawrence, he actually cut a hole in the firewall and moved the engine back. The Oscar regulations allowed engine movement from its stock location up to 12 inches, and so he cut a hole in the firewall and moved the engine back about 12 inches just for a better weight distribution. I don't know how much difference it actually makes. He ran the car for several years in Oscar. Then he sold it to Ross Cameron. Ross continued racing the car in Oscar, and then he sold it to Kelvin Towns. And Kelvin never actually raced the car, but he owned it for a long time, about 30 odd years, from about the mid-1980s through to 2018. And during that time, it was never shown in public. It was just basically hidden in plain view. He wasn't hiding it, but he was slowly restoring the car back to its original Dawson guise. And in 2018, my friend Keith purchased the car and purchased it on the proviso that the restoration continue to what you see here, to its original Kensington Carpets livery as it was most famous and as most people remember it. So I just want to go through some of the details on this car and how some of the original Trans Am series parts have been carried across to this car, and how some of the parts on this car are unique to it and the New Zealand saloon car racing regulations. And so whereas the SCCA Trans Am series had a maximum 5,000cc engine size, here in New Zealand it was 6,000 cc's. And so this car was built with a fairly stout 350 Chev, and was then bored to bring it up to 6,000 cc's. But there were several Trans Am components that were developed for the Trans Am series and that were then carried across to this car. And that includes the rear spoiler, which is, I mean, it's a fairly common piece that was just a stock item on Camaros, second gen Camaros, going right through to the end of the model's life in the early 1980s. But it has quite a fascinating history to it, in that it was first fitted to the car specifically for the Trans Am series. And so for the 1970 Trans Am series, the factory Camaro team, which was Penske Racing, they did a deal with American Motor Company to start running the AMC Javelins, and so the Camaro program then went across to Jim Hall at Chaparral Cars, and Smokey Yunick over in Florida. Smokey himself built one of these Camaros, a second-gen Camaro, just as an R&D car. It was never raced by him in the 1970 Trans Am series, but Jim Hall's Chaparral Cars, who'd come from a sports car racing background, in both Can-Am and world endurance racing, running big block cars in in sports car racing. So the Trans Am and sedan racing was really quite new to Chaparral. But yeah, Chaparral they built 3 cars and they raced 2 of them throughout the 1970 Trans Am. And one of Jim Hall's sponsors was General Electric company Lexan. And Lexan designed a special front spoiler for the cars. The Trans Am regulations for 1970 changed to those of 1969, whereas 1969 the cars had to be fitted with a factory front spoiler. For 1970 they could run any spoiler they wanted as long as it didn't extend beyond the front bumper line and as long as it was basically disappeared from a side view of the car. So pretty much just a flat sheet of alloy with a couple of brake duct holes in it. But Lexan developed a special front spoiler for the Chaparral cars, and it actually flexed at high speed, so it produced more front downforce. And initially the factory Camaros, all the second gen Camaros, were just going to run the regular small one-piece rear spoiler that just sat on top of the deck lid. But they found in testing that all the front downforce being generated by the Lexan spoiler at the nose was creating all sorts of problems in the rear, and the back end was washing out. And so John DeLorean, who was the top man at Chevrolet at the time and was very much behind the Camaro racing program, he went to Pontiac and asked if they could use this three-piece spoiler that was being developed by Pontiac engineers for the Trans Am racing program, which was being run by Jerry Titus and Terry Godsell at TG Racing. Pontiac obviously the engineers really didn't want to give up their amazing high downforce spoiler, but eventually DeLorean talked them into it, and that's how this beautiful 3-piece unit ended up on the back of the Camaro. Apparently the end caps on a Camaro differ slightly to those on a Firebird, but yeah, that was how that ended up as it did. And the Chaparral cars were amongst the best handling cars in the 1970 Trans Am series. Another special piece that's appeared on this car are these amazing Fender Flares, which I'll just run down the side. If you look at the bulge in that, it's quite incredible. Now these flares are incredibly rare. They were originally designed and developed by Fisher Body in Detroit. Fisher Body, of course, was part of General Motors and did various steel bodywork components for General Motors, including full car bodies. And these Fender Flares were actually designed specifically for the Trans Am series. Even though the Trans Am cars were only allowed to run a maximum 8-inch wide wheel, there was no limit on tyre size. So they used to run big fat tyres that popped out the side of a 8-inch wide wheel. And so these beautiful flares were created, and it was they made a mould based on the original steel panel, but obviously pumped out quite a lot. And the mould was made from Kirksite plastic, and these sections were punched from thin gauge steel, and they're not a full replacement panel. It's just a section that really goes from about here or so and is pop riveted and placed, just the section around the actual wheel opening. And from the side angle, you'd never even know. Let me show you from the back. Look at that. It looks amazing. And with vintage Trans Am cars having become so popular and so valuable and so desirable now, and with a historic Trans Am category running in the USA for the original 1966 to 72 Trans Am cars. A lot of these early cars are now being restored, and it's almost impossible. And most of the Trans Am cars, including the factory cars, ran with these Fisher body fender flares, but you can't get them anymore because basically the mould just wore out, had a limited lifespan, and so several of the historic Trans Am cars, they've just had to try and recreate the look of the Fisher body panel without actually being able to use the original mould. But this car here, amazingly enough, these are the original Fisher body flares that have survived on it, and so it's one of the few cars anywhere that can claim that. One of the differences from this car to the cars that ran in the Trans Am series is that this has the RS nose with the Enduro beak in the middle there and the little bumperettes, which in my opinion is the prettiest look of these second gen Camaros. The Trans Am cars all ran a full width bumper, and I don't know for sure, but I assume that the reason for that was because the front spoiler wasn't allowed to extend beyond the front bumper, so we're running the full width front bumper. Just gave you a bit of extra wiggle room to angle the front spoiler out and get a bit more front downforce. Like I say, Trans Am cars all ran 15 by 8 inch wheels, and this car did initially in its first season. It ran 15 by 8 mini light wheels. Then in about 1973, Red purchased these amazing span wheels. These are actually made in New Zealand, incredibly rare. They kind of look a little bit like Halibrands. They've got the support braces and everything in them. Amazingly rare wheels built by Dave Wallace, and the fronts measure 10 inches wide and the backs are 14 inches wide, and they really fill out those big flares nicely. It's incredible that this car, after all these years, different owners and everything, still has these span wheels. And I've only ever seen 2 sets. I'm sure there's probably a few more sets out there. A good friend of mine, Bruce Thompson, owns what is believed to be the only surviving 1969 TG Racing factory Trans Am Firebird. That car came out to New Zealand in about 1972 or so, and that car was raced in New Zealand by Rod Coppins, and Rod fitted a set of these span wheels to that car, and it's still got a set of those to this day. And these are the only 2 sets I've ever seen, and they're amazingly rare and a really nice looking wheel. Let's have a look inside. Now, as you can see, there's no seats. The restoration hasn't quite been completed yet. It's got no engine either, so I can't really show you much of interest under the engine bay, but the interior is basically as the car ran in period. These were basically just production cars. The headliner has been removed, but when I spoke to Kelvin Towns, when I wrote about this car 20 odd years ago, he said the original headliner was still on the car, which is quite extraordinary for a car with such a long racing history. The doors have been replaced by fiberglass doors. This happened when Red owned the car. Initially it ran steel doors, but New Zealand regulations sort of opened up and allowed the fitment of lightweight fiberglass components. So the doors have probably been on the car since 1973, 74, thereabouts. And I'll show you some of the parts down here. This is one of the old dash fascias that came with it, and you can see also the wink mirror, which was a popular 70s attachment on a lot of race cars. Weirdly enough, it's got these Trans Am stickers on it. I don't know why, Pontiac Trans Am stickers on it. Those weren't put on by mistake when the car was restored. They were there in period as well. It's been accurately restored. If you look up the top here, all this original sign writing, the Citizen, the Kensington carpets, all the sign writing, even the number and the background have all been hand painted, just as it was in period. A lot of people get these old historic race cars and they restore them and they just put stickers on, whereas once there was sign written paint, but this one was done properly. This is how they should be done. Looks amazing. Back in the early 1970s it wasn't possible to just buy great big stickers or wraps as is done these days. Everything was done by hand. Looks absolutely incredible. It's just an accurate restoration, as accurate as it can possibly be.